Okay, so Sir Philip Sidney. Let's take a look. It's a tough first sentence. I'll put it on screen again. Neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature, but rather give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker, who having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that secondary nature. So it's tough. Saucy. He says, never let it be deemed too saucy a comparison. Saucy means like bold. So he's saying, don't get offended that I'm going to make a bold comparison. What two things is he comparing in the first sentence? The highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature. This is an extremely important thing to learn about. This is a major sort of philosophical idea that is going to come up again and again and again and again and again. Wit. And he says wit. Usually when we talk about wit, we mean making funny jokes. But what they mean by the word wit is intelligence. And we mean the same thing. If someone's witty, it means they make intelligent jokes. Witty is not fart jokes. It's like fancy wordplay. So wit means intelligence. So he says, neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison. Meaning, don't get offended by the fact that, actually, hold on a second. I think I'm having some trouble with my phone. Okay, well, I can't fix it right now. I'll fix it later. So he says, neither let it be deemed too saucy a comparison. Meaning, don't be offended at this crazy thing I'm about to say. He's going to balance the highest points of man's wit with the efficacy of nature. Efficacy is like effectiveness of nature. And he means like Mother Nature there. So he says, don't get offended that I'm about to make a comparison. But the two things he wants to compare are man's wit, that's a person's intelligence, with the efficacy of nature, meaning things that Mother Nature makes. So what is he comparing? He says, don't get offended, but what I want to talk about is I want to compare and contrast things that human beings make, like plays and poems and that kind of thing, with things that Mother Nature has made, like rocks and trees and the world and the sun. And he means God. But when he says nature, he means, the natural world is the one created by God, whereas the art world is the one created by people. So this is what he's doing. This is what the essay is about. Once you know, and these things are tough to read, but once you get started, once you learn the beginning of them, the rest of it makes so much more sense. So already, the second part of this is going to make so much more sense now that you know he's talking about, he wants to talk about the differences and relationships between man's wit, the things a human being makes with their intelligence, like poems and plays and movies, with things that God has made, like nature and reality. Because a lot of people, and he says, don't think it too bold a comparison, because some people would be offended. Like some people would, like Puritans would say, don't you dare compare the garbage human beings make with the beauty of the natural world that God has made. And they would be very offended. Like, these are so different. Like, God is such a big deal and human beings are for shit. So don't compare the two of them. And so he says, don't get mad at me. I want to compare these two things. All right. So he says, sorry, I for the next 7 minutes, I'm not going to be able to show you the screen because I'm having some screen issues that I can fix in between videos. It says, never let it be deemed too saucy a comparison to balance the highest point of man's wit with the efficacy of nature. Okay, so don't get offended. But he says what he really wants to do is give right honor to the heavenly maker of that maker, who having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature. So when he says he wants to honor the heavenly maker of that maker, he means that he's not trying to offend people by comparing things human beings make to things God made, but he actually wants to honor God, because and this is the interesting part, just as, you can see the Plato in here, just as God made the world and the people in it, people could write a novel and have people in the novel. Right? That God's relationship to authors is like authors' relationships to characters. It's a very famous metaphor that the author of a book is like God. And you can totally understand that if you think about it. When you write a book, a lot of people feel like when they write books, they're not fully in control of them. That the characters seem to want to do things they don't want them to do, like Adam and Eve decide to eat that apple and God told them not to. But also, if you're the author of a book, you could do anything to these people. You're like God. You can just be like, and she got her head chopped off and she's dead. So you get to decide. You're like judge, jury, and executioner if you're writing a novel. You can do anything to those people. So Sidney points out that, like, I'm not trying to offend. I don't want to offend people by comparing what human beings do to what God does. But he says, I want to honor God, because God made the people that make the the stories. Um, he says that and he made an idea, and he says that the heavenly maker of that maker, who having made man to his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature. So the Bible says that God made man in his own image, that human beings are sort of like God. Um, well, one thing Sidney points out, one thing that human beings have in common with God is that God makes a world, and so do human beings. When human beings make a work of art, they're making a little world. If you read a novel, you've made a little world with little people in it, just like God made the world and filled it with 9 billion people, most of whom are assholes. I don't know. They're probably, a lot of people are okay. I haven't met that many of them, but the ones that I've met have been just all right. I'm a little like Hamlet. You can see why I like Hamlet, because I'm a little, that's what Hamlet would say. Um, And interestingly, here he uses the phrase second nature. He says, I want to honor the heavenly maker of that maker, who having made man in his own likeness, set him beyond and over all the works of that second nature. He calls art second nature. Why? Because God makes reality, and then human beings make a second reality in that reality, a movie, the Marvel Cinematic Universe, or whatever. The word nature, it's very, very important. This is a vocabulary word that you need, that you think you don't need, because you think you know what it means. But the word nature is being used in an unusual way here. And if you've taken other classes with me, this has come up before. It's a very, very important vocabulary word. When Spencer. I always call him Spencer. His name's not Spencer. His name's Sidney. There's a different author called Spencer from the same time period, and I always flip them up. Sidney. When Sidney says nature, you're probably picturing trees and rocks and waterfalls, and that's correct. But when he says nature, he means reality. He means God-given reality. So it does mean trees and rocks and rivers and waterfalls, but it also means the sun and the stars and all of the planets in the sky, and it means reality. We actually sometimes will still use nature in that old-fashioned Renaissance sense of it. The Renaissance is the time period from which Sidney is alive. We sometimes still say this, like, if you have a problem, someone might say, well, why don't you tell me the nature of the problem? Right? What does he mean? The rocks and trees and waterfalls are the problem? No, he means tell me what's the reality of the problem. What's the nature of the situation? Means what's the reality of it? Tell me what's really true about it. So Sidney, in his essay, is going to, and by the way, these are obviously, you probably had a hunch about this, but these are much longer. I've sort of grabbed the 2 most interesting pages from each. I did this thing. I bought this book that was like 2,000 pages long, and I read large chunks of it. I read the philosophers that I had a hunch would be the most interesting from having read them years ago. And then I read their essays, and then I took the 2 most interesting pages out of each essay. So I picked the most interesting philosophers in the book, and then I took the 2 most interesting pages from each philosopher, and that's where all the handouts came from. The book I got it all from is called the Norton Anthology of Literary Criticism or something, and there's some information about that on the syllabus. Sorry, if I'm looking weird, my phone is doing weird things with brightness levels, and I'm having a hard time seeing myself, so I don't quite know how long I've been on this for. All right, so it'll get cleared up in 2 minutes. So the point is that Sidney wants to compare. He's thinking about the relationship between art and reality, because of course this is the art and reality unit. And in the art and reality unit, he wants to think about, well, God made reality, and then human beings make a mini reality, which makes them like a mini God when they create a work of art. And he says, so let's talk about the relationship between the world that God made and the world that poets make. Another thing that's going to come up a lot in this class that's very, very important, a lot of the philosophers I'm going to give you are going to say poetry or whatever. But you should understand that whatever they say about poetry is also true of the other arts. So even though I may give you a philosopher who says poetry, you can expand that to mean also music and painting and video games and movies and some modern stuff. Because there's a lot of essays where they have a lot of stuff to say about poetry, but there's when they say things about poetry, you're welcome to think about it as bigger than just a couple of random poems. It's bigger than that. It means art. The word poetry, by the way, comes from an ancient Greek word meaning to make. And so poetry is really just things human beings make, and there's a lot of different kinds of art, and they're sort of so similar to poetry in a lot of ways for purposes of our class that you can talk about them. Okay, I'm going to see if I can fix the brightness problem on the phone, and I will see you in the next video.